Thanks everybody for coming today. I'm going to stand up here. I usually stand down there, but we're recording this for posterity, so I guess I'll speak from up here. I feel kind of imperial up here myself, and I wrote a book criticizing the imperial presidency, so I guess that's a bit ironic. First of all, I'd like to thank Paul and the Rio Grande Foundation for inviting me to speak. It's a great opportunity, and I think organizations like the Rio Grande Foundation are really needed at this time. And of course, many of the issues that are out there with the Tea Party and that sort of thing, it's spot on what the organization is doing. So I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm going to talk about the presidency. And I wrote this book because I would read regular histories of these things, and I decided to take a different approach. But before I get going here, I'd like to give the audience a little quiz. And I realize you're all eating, but you can all just yell out the answers to these questions. And you're probably going to wonder why I'm doing this, but I just want to get a sense of the historical knowledge of the audience. So I'm going to give you some, like 3 or 4 questions. The first one is, what happened on July 4th, 1776?
Nothing.
Okay, sign the Declaration of Independence? Okay. The second question is, who flew the first heavier-than-air aircraft?
Wright brothers.
Okay, the Wright brothers. Who was the first person to fly across the Atlantic? Okay, and the fourth question, and the last question, now this one actually does have to do with the presidency. Who's the 44th President of the United States? Barack Obama. Okay, now, I'd just like to say that you've all flunked, unbelievably, you've all flunked that quiz because none of those answers are right. The Declaration of Independence was not signed on July 4th. The vote for independence, which everyone thought would be the national holiday, was held on July 2nd. Nothing much at all happened on July 4th, actually. The second one, Wright brothers, there was actually a guy, and this is much disputed, it's much forgotten now, but the first person to fly, and he was flying 18 miles when the Wright brothers were flying a few hundred feet, was Gustav Whitehead up in Connecticut. The problem is he was a German immigrant at the time, and he wasn't much of a press hound, but so he was the first actual pilot of a heavier-than-air aircraft. Lindbergh was not the first to fly across the Atlantic. I think he was about the 8th or something like that. The reason he got publicity was because he had a lot of trouble on his trip, and this got on the radio. And so when he got to Paris, he didn't really expect anybody, like a few goats in a field to welcome him, and then there was this outpouring of thousands of people. And he became an instant celebrity. So he wasn't the first, it was just the publicity, and that's how the Wright brothers got where they were as well. Now, the last one relates to the presidency. I'm about to explain why I asked these stupid questions. But Barack Obama, despite what you hear on the media, is not the 44th president of the United States. He's only the 43rd. There have been 44 presidencies, but Grover Cleveland served twice, so there have only been 43 presidents. So that's a niggling little detail. But the reason I mention this is because I want you to question even the most basic things you've been taught in your high school and college history textbooks. And I want you to have that questioning view as we go into this, because every nation has its historical myths. And it's not so much that historians lie, it's just that they leave out a lot of stuff. Or they have a certain perspective. We see history going back the way we are now. And the way we are now is we have a government which consumes state, local, and national 43% of the GDP. Now that's astounding. That's up to European levels. And we see things, we just assume that the government should handle all this stuff, or at least most people do. Maybe this group is a little bit different, this audience. But so I'd like to say that I wrote this book as if I were a founder of the country and evaluated the presidents as I believe that the founders would have evaluated them. And the president at the time was supposed to be a limited office. The Congress and the states were supposed to be the dominant organizations in the government. And the Supreme Court and the presidency were supposed to be lesser among equals. Unfortunately, that's been flipped around. The states have been denuded of much of their power, the Congress as well, and you see the Supreme Courts have a lot more power than the founders envisioned, and of course the executive branch is turned into the imperial presidency. And many conservatives are fine with this, except that the problem with an imperial presidency is it can turn into despotism very quickly. Now, Paul wants me to tell you how I think Obama would rate in my book, but first I'd like to give you sort of a thumbnail sketch of the way I evaluated these people. Now, I based it solely on policy. Warren Harding was caught in the closet with his secretary, and he was a known womanizer. And I didn't take any consideration of personal problems. I didn't consider communication skills, management skills, whether they had soaring rhetoric such as John F. Kennedy or Franklin Roosevelt. All I focused on was policy. Did these presidents take us away from what the founders wanted, peace, prosperity, and liberty, and limited government, and a limited constitutional role for the president, or did they move us backward in time? So that's essentially how I evaluated these men. And of course, I got some very shocking results, even to myself, because I tried to stick with the policy, not to be partisan. In my book, the Democrats had the best and the worst presidents, and the Republicans were someplace in the middle. But you really can't evaluate presidents on the basis of their party affiliation, because oftentimes they get big points, or even are quite effective in doing things that their party don't particularly like. For instance, Richard Nixon went to China. Bill Clinton did welfare reform, etc. So I think given this unusual set of criteria that I've come up with, my list of presidents looks much different than many historians. Now I'm just going to give you an example of how partisanship doesn't really matter, because I think President George W. Bush and President Obama are traveling down similar routes. Now you say, well, how can that be? Because you get the dyed-in-the-wool Democrats saying, well, Obama's a liberal and he's one of us, and of course we would never have anything to do with that slimy George Bush. And then on the other side, you get the conservatives who are saying, come on, you can't, as bad as Bush was, and many conservatives will admit that he wasn't very good, how can you compare him to Obama? Well, I'm about ready to do that, and I think the comparison is tracks quite nicely. Of course, they both didn't do too well combating a natural disaster. Bush had Katrina, and of course Obama had the BP oil spill. But that is probably the thing that's most outside their ability to control. Of course, they both are involved in 2 wars, and Obama is withdrawing from Iraq, but of course now we just had the Secretary of Defense say that we'd be happy to stay if the Iraqis want to let us. And of course, Obama is also involved in Afghanistan, has now doubled down in Afghanistan, much to the approval of George W. Bush in his book. Now, of course, Bush tortured possible terrorists and was really constricting on the civil liberties. Obama, during his campaign, insisted that he was a civil libertarian and has had some of the greatest rhetoric about protecting civil liberties. Since being in office, he's done a little bit better, and he's reduced torture, but of course he's left a loophole for the CIA if you really read the rules really closely. And also on civil liberties, he's a little bit better than Bush, but not much. He's kept many of the civil liberty reducing measures, and he's had his Justice Department actively try to keep cases out of court, blanket national security protection. They bought into the Patriot Act, other things. So I don't think he's been very good at all. Now, the Tea Party is all incensed about Obama's socializing car companies, but of course, Bush socialized the AIG in insurance company and finished socializing the big mortgage lenders of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and of course bailed out the financial institution at a total of about $700 billion. Well, of course, Obama had the $787 billion stimulus package, which was one giant pork project. You see this parallel going down. Of course, Bush had started the stimulus, and of course, Obama took it and ran with it, both practicing Keynesian economics, incidentally. Interesting, as Richard Nixon, the Republic famously said, we're all Keynesian now, and apparently George W. Bush is still in that camp. Now, I think there's, even in the healthcare view, George Bush certainly was a big spender. He spent the most on domestic policy of any president since Lyndon Johnson, both Democrats and Republican presidents. And he had the Medicare drug addition, which was, of course, the first major expansion of entitlement programs since the Great Society. That doesn't seem like a conservative thing to do to me. And of course, we have, on the other side of the ledger, Obama with this bureaucratic and expensive healthcare reform. So I think what you really have is sort of a mirror image here, as you're seeing. Bush has what I call fake tax cuts. And he cut taxes, but he didn't cut spending. He wildly increased spending. So now we have record deficits, 10% of GDP, which is Ronald Reagan, 1984, had a 5% GDP deficit. But it's the same principle, fake tax cut. I'll go into Reagan, and I'll talk about Reagan in a second. But of course, Obama is going to extend the tax cuts, these fake tax cuts, either most or all of them. Now, why do I call them fake tax cuts? And one last thing I'll mention before I get into the tax cuts. The Bush administration encroached on the federal role of education, expanded it, which is traditionally a state and local issue, especially a local issue. And of course, now Obama is going with his Race to the Top program to expand upon that. So you see this parallel. And these fake tax cuts, the reason I call them fake tax cuts, which both Obama and Bush are perpetrating, I'll say. When you cut, it's easy for politicians to cut taxes. It's never easy for them to cut spending because you have all these vested interests. You get thrown out of office. So what happens, the Republican Party is particularly adept at this. They've developed, well, we'll cut your taxes. And Ronald Reagan did that. But of course, he had no intention of cutting spending at all, and he didn't. Ronald Reagan doubled the size of the federal government, and the portion of federal spending as a proportion of GDP increased during Reagan's period. And of course, these fake tax cuts, if you don't reduce spending, then you either have to increase taxes later on, which of course Reagan did, or you have to borrow money because you have a big deficit, which Reagan did, or you have to print money, which of course is what we're doing now. Now, believe it or not, raising taxes is the best of those alternatives. Because when the government borrows lots of money, it crowds out private borrowing, and of course then it strangles the economy. Printing money is even worse because eventually, at some point down the line, you're going to get a lot of inflation. So if you cut taxes without cutting spending, they're fake tax cuts. And I'm the first one to love tax cuts, but I think we really need to focus on spending cuts, and they need to be severe spending cuts. Obama has taken the opposite of the socialist, more socialist economies of Germany and Britain. They're cutting spending heavily, and we are continuing on the Keynesian track here with Obama trying to stimulate us out of the recession by increasing government spending instead of cutting it. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan because I think he's probably one of the most overrated presidents among conservatives. And actually, his image was burnished. Many conservatives were much more critical of Ronald Reagan when he was president, but his image was burnished in the late 90s by Grover Norquist and some other activists in Washington because they wanted a foil against Clinton. But if you look at the policy record, in many ways, Bill Clinton was more conservative than, especially on economic issues, than Ronald Reagan. And it's not just me that says this. There are two conservative economists, Vedder and Galloway, and they really give, rhetorically, they kind of dance around Reagan's record, but when they rate the presidents on purely economic things, they rated them on the limiting government and fighting inflation, which are the two most important things. Ronald Reagan placed 5 places below Bill Clinton. And the reason is Bill Clinton cut the federal government as a portion of GDP, and Ronald Reagan increased it. Some of the other things to know about Ronald Reagan, as I mentioned, he doubled the size of government and increased the spending as a portion of GDP. But his, David Stockman was his primary budget director and architect of Reagan's plan, said that the Reagan Revolution failed because they never did cut spending. And that's true. Now, in other things, Reagan, national security, he ramped up the interventions, foreign interventions. Both Ford and Carter kept those to a minimum. And I'm not big on foreign intervention because I think it has a lot to do with big government. In fact, war is the largest cause of big government in human history. And much of our welfare state now originates from World War I, when the economy was mobilized for war. So I think we really need to pay more attention to that. And many conservatives of old used to do that. It used to be the liberals that wanted to go to war, and the conservatives like Robert Taft and those guys were against war because they realized that war not only leads to increased national security spending, but also most of the programs, the welfare programs that we have in this country have stemmed from war at one point or another. Social Security originally stems from Civil War pensions. This employer-based health care that we have, which burdens businesses, came about in the war because there were controls on prices and wages, so that businesses couldn't pay more because the government said they couldn't. So of course they started offering these fringe benefits. These are just a couple of the things that have happened as a result of war. Now, Reagan was very bad on terrorism. He made new enemies with Libya, and he also caused one of the few threats to the homeland by heavily aiding Al-Qaeda. Now, Jimmy Carter started that, but Ronald Reagan really went into it with a zest. He also emboldened terrorists. The Republicans always mention the fact that Clinton hightailed it out of Somalia, and that emboldened terrorists. But if you ask Osama bin Laden himself, he will tell you that his original motivation that he could get the United States out of the Islamic wilderness, what he's trying to do, was when Reagan pulled the troops out of Lebanon after Hezbollah destroyed the Marine barracks in 1983. Ronald Reagan also sold heavy weapons to a state supporter of terrorism, Iran. And the real rap I have, the most severe rap I have on Ronald Reagan, unfortunately, is Iran-Contra. And this, I feel, was worse than Watergate. And Watergate was certainly bad. But Iran-Contra, there was talk of impeaching Reagan at the time for this. He went around in secret Congress's appropriation of funds. Now, if you stop to think about it, Congress's main powers are war-making and the budget. Well, Congress's war-making powers have long, since 1950, when we don't declare war anymore, have been virtually erased. They still have some control over the budget, but they have to know what's happening to have control over the budget. And he took proceeds from, the Congress had told him not to fund these Contras. Now, whether you thought that was a good idea or not, Congress had said not to do it, and they secretly did this in violation of the Constitution and the law. In fact, Reagan joked that he was going to be thrown in jail for violating the Arms Export Control Act, which was a criminal violation at the time. So these are some of the, now my intention here is not to run Ronald Reagan through the mill, because there's been plenty of other bad presidents like John F. Kennedy and that sort of thing. But it is to show that Ronald Reagan wasn't as conservative as he's made out to be. And I think conservatives really ought to look at that again. In fact, Jimmy Carter is the first modern conservative president. He deregulated 4 industries, and he was quite concerned about the budget deficit and fighting inflation. And many conservatives, of course, don't like Jimmy Carter for whatever reason. And Jimmy Carter wouldn't consider himself a libertarian at all, I don't think. But like I said, I don't care what people say. You have to look at the policy record. And I think Jimmy Carter has more of a libertarian policy record than almost any modern president. Dwight D. Eisenhower is fairly good in the modern category. But I think some of these familiar faces like Ronald Reagan and George Bush, who claim to be conservatives, a lot of the things that they did weren't very conservative. You could maybe call them neoconservatives, which means you concentrate on spending a lot on defense and, oh, well, maybe we can cut some off, trim some off the government at the edges, but I wouldn't call them traditional conservatives or libertarians. So now I have, I guess I have a few more minutes left. I thought what I would do is just talk about any president that somebody wants in the audience. If anybody would like me to talk about a particular president that they either hate or love, or don't know if they hate or love, you can pipe up now. Yes,
Lincoln. Lincoln.
Lincoln. Well, I don't rate Lincoln in the basement, but I think many people ignore Lincoln's despotic tendencies. He closed hundreds of newspapers across the country and threw a lot of their editors in jail. And he did a lot of unconstitutional things. Now people say, well, you know, he was trying to save the Union. But actually, he even admitted that he was going to provoke the Confederacy to fire on Fort Sumter, because he said, let them fire on bread. And so he knew what would happen when he sent the relief ship, because during the last part of the Buchanan administration, the Confederates had fired on a resupply ship. Now you could say that, well, Clinton freed the slaves, and certainly he did end up supporting the 13th Amendment, but the Emancipation Proclamation freed virtually no slaves at all. In fact, he freed the slaves in the territory that the Confederate Army was on, which of course isn't freeing anybody. And a few slaves were freed as the Union marched on, but the Union Army also used slave labor when the African Americans would come over thinking they would get safe haven. Some of the Union generals also used slave labor. So I think we fought a war where 620,000 Americans were killed. It's still the war that is the most severe in the country's history, simply because both sides were Americans. And we got a very uncertain, incidentally, 38,000 black soldiers got killed in that war, at least 38,000. That was 38,000 for the Union. There was some limited use of black soldiers on the Confederate side. But after the war, things were good for African Americans, or at least a little better, for a couple of years. But then, of course, the military occupation of the South led to the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. So not only did the blacks have to worry about where their next meal was coming from, because their masters no longer provided it, food, shelter, and clothing, but they also had to worry about being killed. So the aftermath of this war caused so much commotion. We had the black codes and the Jim Crow laws, which the blacks were slightly more free after this, but the African Americans were by no means totally free after the war. I think Lincoln could have considered doing a couple of things that he didn't, and that was that he was for compensated emancipation. Most countries in the world freed their slaves peaceably, and they did it by compensated emancipation. We were virtually the only major country that had a war, and it was the worst war in the country's history. So if Lincoln had followed up with his earlier notion of compensated emancipation, there would have been, no matter what price he had to pay to free the slaves, it would have been better than this war. The other thing to note is that the war was not really fought to free the slaves. That just sort of came from the war. there were three basic groups, and only one of them slavery really mattered to, and that was the Deep South. Those states seceded because Lincoln was perceived, although a moderate on slavery, he was perceived as going to, I think the South sort of overreacted to his presidency, what he had said on the campaign trail. But then there was Virginia and the top border states that didn't secede until Lincoln called for volunteers to fight, which they believed to be unconstitutional. And then there was the North, and what Lincoln was fighting for. Lincoln famously said, well, if I have to free all the slaves, I'll do it. If I have to free some of the slaves and not others, I'll do it. And if I have to free no slaves, I'll do it. I want to save the Union. So he was considering, his major goal was not to end slavery. It was to save the Union. And of course, like Thomas Jefferson, he was for, even if when the slaves were freed, he was for shipping the slaves back to Africa, because he didn't think whites and blacks could live together. So the Lincoln record is much less ideal than when you see the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. But certainly, Lincoln deserves credit for the 13th Amendment because he did support that, and I give him credit for that. But I think he really probably could have freed the slaves with more peaceful means than he did. And I think one of my premises of the book is oftentimes presidents get more points with historians if they've served during a war. It doesn't matter if they caused the war, like James Polk. It doesn't matter, or Lyndon Johnson, or it doesn't matter if they aggravated tensions or if there are other alternatives. And I think we sometimes, and war, as I say, is so important to me because big government, it's very difficult for me to meet libertarians who are still very hawkish because war is the biggest instrument of big government. And I think we need to pay more attention to that domestically, that it ruins the Republic. The Republic of Rome was ruined with empire. And I think also that we're going down that road here. Our president has become imperial since Harry Truman, and probably even hyper-imperial under George Bush and Barack Obama. So I think we really need to pay attention to that. We also need to dig down in some of these presidents that we revere. For instance, Thomas Jefferson is one of the greatest Americans because he wrote the Declaration of Independence. But in my book, as I point out, he sort of got a little drunk with the powers that he received, and he wasn't that good of a president. So we have to distinguish, we have to go, we can't, I think, go into idol worship here. We need to reassess some of these presidents. Now, of course, I rank presidents very highly who most people would think were obscure, who stuck with the limited vision of the presidency, which was the founder's intention, who limited government, and who relied on the people. That's supposed to be the Republican motto now, is let the people, the people are the country. It's their industry. It's their charity that runs the country. But in practice, we don't really do that. And so I think we really need to reassess some of these, the way we think about this, and have a really honest discussion about some of the things that happen. It doesn't matter that some of these people, Thomas Jefferson, you can never take the Declaration of Independence away from him, but you can say that he made some big mistakes when he was a president, and I think we can do that. We put our heroes in black and white, and I think there are many shades of gray. Does anybody else have
Tyler.
John Tyler. Well, the reason Paul is saying John Tyler is because I put him first. And most people know him as Tippy Canoe and Tyler too. But Tippy Canoe, he only lasted a month. That was William Henry Harrison, and so Tyler took over. And he was a Whig, and a Whig at the time was just an anti-Jacksonian party. There was kind of a polyglot party, but they all hated Andrew Jackson, and they thought he had usurped executive power, which he had. But deep down, John Tyler was a Democrat, and the Democrats at the time were party of small government. It's my opinion that the Republicans started out as a party of small government, and they've only been a party of, big government, and they've only been a party of small government during the Harding and the Coolidge administrations. At the time, the Democrats in the 1840s, the Democrats were the party of small government, and they did that throughout the 19th century. But he ran into his, he had converted from being a Democrat to being a Whig because he hated Jackson. But the problem is the Whigs were for all these, they were the precursor to the Republicans. They were for all these water projects and internal improvements is what was the code word of the day. It just meant subsidizing big business with railroads and the railroad companies, et cetera, canals, et cetera. And he was against all that, so he was impeached by his own party, or they started impeachment proceedings. John Tyler, like my other 4 or 5 top presidents, were all one-term presidents. And the reason that they were one-term presidents is because they did a lot of stuff that was politically courageous. And I would, to some extent, I would include Jimmy Carter among those people. But you have, I rank Tyler first, Grover Cleveland second, Martin Van Buren third, Rutherford B. Hayes fourth, Chester Arthur fifth. Now that's a combination of Whigs, Democrats, and Republicans, so it didn't really matter which party you were in if you did the right thing. When, for instance, Rutherford B. Hayes was from the late 1800s, was a Republican, and so was Chester Arthur. And at the time, the Republican Party they were for massive government spending. What was massive at the time, it's not as massive when we look back on it, but Rutherford B. Hayes was a fiscal conservative, and he didn't really believe what his party was doing. And the same thing with John Tyler, and they paid a great price for doing it, because John Tyler not only didn't get his party's nomination, his own party tried to impeach him, which I think is the only time that that's happened in the history of the country. Yes?
You can add in favor of Tyler that he kept us out of a civil war. In that time, the North, just like before the Civil War, increased the tariffs to the extent that the South Carolinians were going to secede. And he got the North to back down and prevented, by being a diplomat, prevented the Civil War at that time. In contrast to Lincoln, who his stand on tariffs really was one of the major factors for causing it.
Yes, that was a big problem, is that the South was paying most of the taxes, and most of these so-called internal improvements to help big business was in the North, because the North was industrialized way before the South. So yes, Tyler did that. And also, that's a good point, and I think it brings up the larger point that presidents are never congratulated for avoiding wars. Like Martin Van Buren, who I rate third, he avoided a couple different wars that we could have gotten into. But yet people rate James Polk very highly, and I realize I'm in New Mexico, and New Mexico would be in the United States if Polk hadn't come along. Well, maybe it would have. Maybe some other president would have attacked Mexico and grabbed it, just like Polk did. But Polk was quite on the opposite end. He tried to start 2 wars at the same time: Britain over the Oregon Territory and Mexico. And his Secretary of State was appalled. He couldn't believe that Polk was trying to do this, but Polk was very belligerent and wanted to do it. So we tend to, and Polk is regarded as a much better president than by conventional historians, Tyler Van Buren, people who avoided wars. So that's an excellent point. I think it brings up a larger point that we perhaps ought to congratulate people for avoiding wars instead of necessarily getting into them. Does anybody else have one? Yes, sir.
Tell me more about Chester and Arthur. I felt when I read some stuff about him, I felt he was underrated. Then I was really surprised to hear you mention this number 5.
Well, I think he is very underrated. He was one of the, he was probably the best dressed president, but I include that just as an aside. I didn't rate him on that. The only thing he really did wrong was he took Rutherford B. Hayes's, Rutherford B. Hayes, there was a patronage system that Andrew Jackson had put in where if you got elected, you just threw all the other guys out and you put your own cronies in. And nobody really had any qualifications. So Rutherford B. Hayes was trying to take some of the politics out of government by this crass he was trying to make it more of a civil service, just to take the, like, government employees were taxed by the whatever administration was in for their campaigns. So it was very politicized. But Arthur came in after Hayes, and he went a little too far and started putting in civil service protections where you couldn't fire people. And now, of course, you can hardly fire anybody from the government. So that I rap Arthur for that. The other thing I rap Arthur for was he's really he started ramping up the Navy for no real reason. There was no threat. And then once they had this Navy, of course, Roosevelt and McKinley and all those later presidents really turned into a swaggering people with it. But otherwise, Arthur was for small government. And it's interesting because when he ran the Customs House in New York, it was kind of perceived as being corrupt. So Rutherford B. Hayes had fired him. Well, when he got elected president, he had this reputation of being kind of a corrupt crony type guy. And so, you know, people react to what they're criticized for. Like Nixon, he went to China. Bill Clinton did welfare reform. Well, Arthur turned into a new guy and was actually, that's why he was doing this civil service thing, because he wanted to be perceived as clean up. He went a little too far, but I think he actually ran a pretty clean administration. He stayed within the limits of the Constitution, and he was for small government in general. And so I think Arthur, he had a weird mustache and beard too, but you know, can't hold that against him. So I think he ranks up there with the best of them. I rated him number 5. So he certainly, see, none of these guys are dazzling, because if the original purpose of the founders was to have a guy who executed the laws, administered the government, and let the Congress take the power. And when you have distributed power, you get into fewer wars. When we had the era of Congress back in the 1800s, we got into a lot fewer wars than we do when we have an imperial executive, like, for instance, Clinton. Clinton was intervening. That's the one rap I have on Bill Clinton, is he was intervening constantly overseas for really no reason, and he did so without declaring war. And that's what we have now. We have executive powers that are unbelievable. I mean, Barack Obama, if he could declare me a terrorist, and they could have the military and the CIA try to kill me. There's this Alaki guy who may actually be a terrorist, and he's a U.S. citizen. He's not in a war zone. There's no immediate threat, and they've targeted him for assassination, and everybody knows it. But they haven't proved anything in a court of law, and there's no hot war that depends, hey, this guy, we got to get him. There's not even an immediate threat that this guy's caused that they can tell. So the president can declare anybody a terrorist and murder him. Now, of course, the president doesn't go out and do that because of the political constraints, but he could. And this is where we are with executive power. And that's almost a fiat type of power from a police state. And of course, I'm not saying we are a police state, but some of these things, if we keep going this way, sooner or later we're going to lose a big chunk of what our country stands for. And I think we've, to some extent, done that already, but I think it's going to get worse. Yes, sir.
Ivan, the top 5 that you mentioned are closer to the Constitution in terms of timeline. So how did the timeline, the further that we get away and get more modern, the degradation of civil liberties, and also the reinterpretation of the executive branch and their powers and stuff. So your top 5 are what I would think would be the obscure early ones. And as we went on, I don't know your top 5, what the last one was 100 years ago, or
well, I know what you're going towards. Yeah. But I actually tried to take that into account because, like when Obama takes office, suppose he wanted to reduce the government is massive, and it's hard to reduce the government because it's like a big ratchet wrench. You know, once you get these programs in there, you have the vested interest, you can't get rid of them. And so the government grows, and then it's not easy to move back. But my second 5 include more modern presidents. And what I did, the way I approached it was, I just said, okay, this president is taking off at this time. The government is this big, and the powers of the presidency are X on this date. Did he move us closer or away from the founder's vision? So Jimmy Carter, I give a fairly high rating to. Dwight Eisenhower, I give a very high rating to. And Warren Harding, I would consider probably anything after the start of the 20th century as a more modern president. Those three presidents got fairly high ratings as well. It wasn't just, and some like Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, when we had really small government back then, didn't get very high ratings. And I mentioned this in the book that Monroe did some things that really put us on the road to big government, even though the government was small at the time. So I tried to take that into account, because otherwise, George Washington would be the best president and Barack Obama would be the worst president, simply because the government tends to expand over time. But I tried to say, well, some presidents were trying to take us back to the time, and we did have a movement back from Jackson. Everyone recoiled in horror from Jackson, so we went back until the Civil War, and then everybody kind of recoiled from that. So we had a few good presidents there until we got to McKinley again, and then once we hit World War I, I think there was no returning for big government, because the government really mobilized the entire economy. And FDR gets the blame from people on the right for creating all these government programs, and he certainly did that. But really, most of those government programs were hung over from the war. They just changed the letters, and sometimes they didn't even change the letters much, and they still had the same guys running them. So World War I, I think, was the really when permanent big government became the norm. And that's why I rate Woodrow Wilson the worst president in U.S. history, because he ruined the entire 20th century, and he's still working on the 21st. The problems in Iraq are as a result of the World War I, so we see these. Woodrow Wilson is still out there hovering, even though most people don't realize it.
As a minor point, but an important one. Keynes, the economist and historian, would agree with you 100%. There's a difference between Keynesian policy in 1934 with 25% unemployment and $100 million deficit, okay, versus now at the correctly labeled neo-Keynesian, which means, hey, a $1.3 trillion, and that endangers our existence and the standard of living of all of our children. And that's why it's different.
Well, I think it's different, but I think Keynesian, Milton Friedman said we won the battle in the academic world, but unfortunately the press, even the financial press, hasn't been as kind to Milton Friedman and the right free market people. And I think there is a question, and that is, in my mind, Keynesian economics was sort of invented to justify government involvement rather than the other way around. And so I think, yes, there is a difference, but I think the real question is Keynesian economics valid? And I think what you're going to see, the two economies that are performing best in Europe are Germany and UK, and what are they doing? They're drastically cutting their budgets, and this restores confidence. And I think Barack Obama, I mean, we had this massive stimulus, but it was mainly pork projects everywhere. Do we really need to do a lot of this stuff? You dig holes and fill them up, and I realize I'm exaggerating there, but it didn't seem to, it's like pushing on a string. I mean, if the Keynesians were right, we wouldn't have had stagflation in the 70s. We would have had a massive recession after World War II, which we didn't have, and also Japan would be would be growing, but Japan keeps these Keynesian pushing on a string type things, and it doesn't work. So maybe Japan and maybe this country will get on a better track. And I think if you look at deficit reduction, it's best to have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, because when we had a Republican president and a Democratic Congress with Ronald Reagan, it didn't work. But with Clinton, Newt Gingrich was very helpful to Clinton, and I have much more respect for Newt Gingrich, even though he's a blustering idiot, than I do for Ronald Reagan, because he did try to cut the budget, and he did. He was only moderately successful, or I don't know how you want to characterize Gingrich's success rate, but he certainly attempted to cut spending, and that's what we really need to do. We can cut taxes, and I'm all for taxes, but you can't cut taxes if you're running massive deficits. I think you really got to, and it's hard work. It's politically much harder to cut spending than it is taxes, but we can't allow the fake tax cuts. And on the other side, the Democrats will pump up the spending and not raise taxes to pay for it. So you've got the flip coin. You know, if you're going to do this stuff, you really have to pay for it. And taxes is the least objectionable way to pay for it than borrowing or printing money. But of course, I don't want to really do any of that. I think we should reduce the spending, and then we can reduce the taxes, even do it at the same time. Thanks, Paul.